right, everybody, we are back as promised with Frater O on the program. This week we're talking about the second degree. We wanted to talk about it a couple weeks ago, and we missed our shot, so we're going to hit it up before the new year. Call me crazy. I'm sure we will eventually talk the third degree at some point in the future. But anyway, welcome back to the program, Frater O.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back, and I look forward to our discussion this evening. I know we just talked briefly a minute before we recorded here, and man, it's going to be an interesting show. So guys, buckle in, sit down, enjoy the ride, and we're going to take you on quite an interesting journey on the second degree.
Just, I guess, some general history on the second degree. So a lot of guys out there, you know, your newer Masons and things, you might not be aware. Masonry, as it is today, was not always this way. Up until 1717, your magic year in Masonry, I guess, there were only the two degrees. There was the entered apprentice and the fellow, or fellow craft. Fellow, multiple sources define the word fellow, and they kind of break it down. Either it's fee law or philoi, which Masonic Bible even has an entrance in there which says that it either means bound in mutual trust, or it could mean philologian, which is follower, which is kind of interesting because at that point you're actually no longer just this entered apprentice person coming in and bearer of burden. You're an associate. You are the brother who, you're not the master, you're not the low guy on the totem pole, you're the helper bee, you're the worker, you're the associate, entitled to some additional benefits. So it is interesting to note that. But what is kind of interesting is that the fellow did have, around 1717, they went ahead and created a system for a third degree. That system is first recorded, I think, in May of 1725 as the first Master Mason degree ever recorded. Before that, though, elements of the third degree were used in a somewhat high, quote-unquote, we'll say, high-degree ceremony where a senior fellow, perhaps somebody who served as the master of a lodge or something of that nature, the senior fellow was given a ceremony where he was given a kind of a sign and a word pertaining to the degree, or not the degree, just the high honor. And I'll spill the beans for you on what that word was and what the sign was, because those are long dead and not used in Masonry today. But the sign of the honored senior fellowcraft was backbone, and the word was matchpin, which is pretty interesting. And I don't exactly know the significance of matchpin, but we can make some huge correlations to backbone. Frater O has mentioned it before. Go ahead and enlighten.
If you look at we've talked about this before, the allegory of King Solomon's temple and the human body, being one and the same. And if you look at the spinal column, being the area to channel energy and enlightenment, one might think that the match pin is one when you light the backbone, you light that up and you channel that energy. Maybe it's about the Kundalini energy or chi or whatever you want to call it, or whatever. There's many different names.
It's striking. It's really interesting to hear about it. So when we think about it, Frater just made this allusion to the human body. And in that second degree, a lot of people don't think it's so based on the sciences, but really it has a really deep philosophical pull. What we look at is, as you come into a lodge of fellowcrafts, when you become a Mason, you kind of go on a virtual tour, per se. And that's all I'll say about it. But 4 walls in a lodge. It's an oblong, square, or a rectangle. And you have these 4 cardinal virtues that are in the lodge, right? You have the east, west, north, and south. And so we kind of, on the esoteric level, we look at the east being spirituality, the west being kind of our normal, rational thoughts, things we understand, rational understanding. The south is kind of where the east and the west come together in this perfect balance that we should strive to be. And of course, then there's the opposite, which is the opposite of this perfect balance, which is where you start your tour in the lodge, right? So you go through the north, and it is what we call the lowest common denominators of our being. So everything that's the worst parts of all of us are kind of represented in this idea of north. And then it's further kind of going through where we look at north as this self, like if you look at them in learning abilities. So the north is self-impression, the west would be reason, the south would be the intellect, and the east would be your spiritual intuition. And what we find, if you look at like studies about humans and the way we learn, most people never go beyond self-impression or reason. They use those two things their whole life for learning. There's a really interesting book. It's really pretty funny because the book can be probably found for $5 at your Barnes & Noble, like holiday bookend bin special, but it's called Freemasonry Illustrated. And the guy actually makes an interesting point, and that's something we all know, which is you have to it's something we've talked about on the show, you have to be able to awaken that spiritual intuition in order to have a full knowledge of self and the world, and that the thoughts, words, and your deeds should reflect this balance that you're trying to get to. And so it's interesting that we go on this tour. And just before we started the program tonight, Frater O shared with me a quote from a book that you wouldn't quite find, perhaps Masonic or otherwise, but I'll have him read the quotes, and then if you can, try to take out anything that would allude to what this is, and then we'll tell them what it's from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
So the first code is, there is no emotion, there is only peace. The second code is, there is no ignorance, there is knowledge. The third, there is no passion, there is serenity. Fourth, there is no chaos, there is harmony. And the last but not least, there is no death, there is the forest.
All right, so of course, if you guessed the last bit, it's Star Wars, The Jedi Path. As he alluded to before the program, he said it was very appropriate for this evening's show. When we think about the way a lodge kind of works and this dynamic of it actually being this human body, and you're going on a tour, in a way you're going on a tour, I should say, we really emphasize these sciences and things. But it goes so much deeper than that, and it's that looking beneath that surface level. And I'll just let you kind of jump in here.
Yeah, definitely down the road, I think we should do an episode just on the correlations between Star Wars and Masonry, or just the idea of...
That would be epic.
You touched on the importance of the definition of fellowcraft, which is really key to hit home. But the first degree we talked about really controlling the body and the fundamentals on what the body is. And you kind of alluded to this earlier, and how the second degree is about controlling the mind, and how the mind and body go together, and how important that mind is in controlling aspects of yourself and bettering yourself. And it's interesting, I'm not going to allude to it, but I'm not going to mention the working tools that are presented as an entered apprentice. There's three in particular, three that are really important. And when they're explained to you, they explain how to apply them and really what they're for. It's not for the operative purpose, it's for the more speculative aspect of your human mind, and how amazing that is. I always love to digress back, and you mentioned before regarding the four different corners of the lodge. And we kind of talked about this before we even jumped on the show, on how the north, the east, the west, and the south all can also correspond with an element: earth, air, water, fire, and then the fifth element, which is sometimes alluded to. And there's some really good movies that allude to that as well. There's one movie in particular that talks about the fifth element and the importance of the fifth element and what that is. And if you get what I'm talking about, great. If not, well, then I think you should dig a little bit deeper. And if you look at what's presented to you in the second degree, and how you're taught to explore the arts, you're taught to explore the sciences, and then you're taken on this amazing journey. And in this journey, you meet certain characters again, and you're taken on this certain path. And what's explained to you is there's a ladder. And on this ladder, there's a system of checks and balances. Now, if we look at that compared to your mind, there's fail-safe. There's absolutely fail-safes. If you start talking deep on a topic and someone's not ready for that, it's not going to stick. Well, the same thing can be said for the warden. If you truly have not done your work as a mason, and you haven't focused on your ashlar and squared the corners and made it right to bring the stone to put it to wherever it's going to go, you're not going to be able to get past that first warden or the second warden to be able to truly put your stone where it's going to. I'm only going to allude to where that journey is, because the person that's been through the second degree, they know where that is and who in the discussion that happens in the lecture that goes on there. That's very, very significant. But if we look at King Solomon's temple, again, as a human body, you're taught about two different pillars, those two different pillars possibly being legs. And then you're taken on this journey upwards into a certain area. That's pretty cool. If you look at King Solomon's temple, it's pretty obvious where that place is if you look at it as a human body and how important that place is.
Would you call that place, I mean, some people will debate it, whether that place can be either in the mind, represented as the pineal gland, or some people represent it as in the chest cavity where the solar plexus is. What's your thought on this?
I believe it's the heart, because if you look at the east representing the head, and it's the holies of holies, right? It's the place where only the priests of the high temple could only go access to where King Solomon kept the Ark of the Covenant, which was represented in the east, in the Holy of Holies. And then if you take a step back and you look at that chamber, and it's directly correlated with the heart. At least my thoughts. What do you think? I know there's arguments that go back and forth about this.
All right. So when we talked about, there's people out there that say, no way. There is no correlation between Solomon's temple and the human body. That's just your interpretation. However, it is also the interpretation of the most worshipful Grand Lodge of ancient free and accepted Masons of the state of Illinois. That's right. In the 1967 Handbook, Part 71, Solomon's Temple. This is composed of questions and answers, and this is not giving away any ritual teachings or anything, but this is interesting, right? Because this is something we used to teach, and this is not found in the new versions of these books. So, what is the symbolic meaning of King Solomon's temple? Symbolic interpretation concerning the Temple of Solomon in all its aspects are practically inexhaustible. However, all rational opinion seems to center on the symbolic representation of man as the temple of God. So basically, it alludes to a whole lot more, but it's laid out right there. It's telling you that is what the lodge is. So if you were kind of leaning that way and you're like, yeah, but we really need some authoritative proof, than just two guys talking about it all the time. Well, there it is. I'm sure if you look in some of your Grand Lodge books, official teachings, you might find the same thing. But again, if you want to know what book that comes from, it is the 1967 edition of the Intender Handbook from Illinois. I'm showing it to the camera like everybody can see it. This is an audio-only podcast, but unfortunately, guys, I am not able to scan and get this out to you guys. It's just too many pages. I certainly could probably scan that section if you all are interested. It would be pretty interesting, I think. But I digress. I'll give it back to Fratero.
This is the battle constantly of people saying it is or it isn't. And what matters to the people that are listening to this, and the people that are that are true seekers, is whatever works for you works for you. That's all that matters. No one can ever take that away from you. And so what works for me might be a little bit different than what works for Robert or any other brother. So but as long as you grab what you need on your journey for truth is all that matters. And we're talking about the details of the tenets of Masonry. So I think there's so much covered in the second degree. It's like, where do we go? It's like drinking through a fire hose. You're bombarded by so much.
Let's start with some basic concepts, right? Like one of the things, and we've covered this on the roundtable, were the 7 liberal arts and sciences, where we cover grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Now, what we can kind of gather from all this is that you're taught to study the sciences, and more importantly, philosophy. And many writers, Masonic books, and things of the nature will attribute philosophy as the house in which all religious mystery is stored. And it's interesting that we're charged to kind of look at philosophy in those ways, to dive into just philosophy in general, being a sort of catch-all for the mysteries of religion. We looked at several elements where we talked about water, air, fire, and earth, where they talk about water as being this physical nature in a physical form. Air is supposed to be symbolic of your mentality. Fire is kind of your will, so your ability to get things done, perhaps, if you want to look at it in that way. Then earth, where everything comes together, and earth is used to stabilize the other three. And then, of course, Fratero did allude to the 5th element with Bruce Willis.
A 5th element.
Just kidding. But
You mentioned that the several liberal arts, the significance that I've found in my journey is that take each one of those and apply them to the Eastern philosophical thought of chakras, which we've mentioned before. So,
Okay,
another thing that's taught in the that really hit home for me was the 5 pillars system. So, in any architecture, you have Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, composite.
so Frater, what about is there a correlation between the pillars, their diameters and heights and things like that when we talk about these 5 pillars?
Absolutely. So Tuscan is 1/7, and then Doric is 1/8, Ionic is 1/9, Corinthian and composite is 1/10. The first 3, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, were designed by the Greeks, which was the original order of architecture, different from each, of course. But if you study the King Solomon's Temple, it's really significant on which pillar was where, and the outer aspects, and then you get inner, and then the further east you go, and the more significant things change.
Pretty interesting. We have a book in my lodge, and it was kind of odd that I found it as an entered apprentice, and it was the 5 Orders of Architecture, and it's not a Masonic book at all. And I said to myself, why do we have this book in here? But it was pretty easy to see why we had the book once I got my second degree. And some of what you just heard Fratero talk about is mentioned in the degree. We talk about the 5 orders in architecture. I mean, there's nothing secret there. And what those pillars represent. And it really just kind of ties back into this element of bringing these aspects of yourself into alignment. I've even seen depictions where we have the 5 pillars placed out in a shape of a pentagram with a pillar at each point, which is pretty interesting. Not in any kind of satanic way. We all know that the pentagram in pop culture, for whatever reason, has this satanic overtone, but within the occult or esoteric schools or a mystery school wisdom type thing, the pentagram is actually the sign that Pythagoras used to distinguish who was a part of his philosopher group when they would meet supposedly at midnight. That was, that's kind of maybe where the idea of a grip came from, was that they would have a pentagram on their palm and they would check that. They would, draw it with charcoal at nighttime before they go to the meeting. So kind of interesting there, and that this pentagram might represent some other kind of form of equilibrium within your mental state.
Also, too, about the pentagram, you can find the correlations written extensively about by Manly P. Hall on the microcosm of man. There's a really good book, Man, the Greater Symbol, and that gets really deep into the esoteric nature of man. And there's a lot of illusion of King Solomon's Temple and the pineal gland. And he also talks deeply about the several liberal arts and how important that was for any craftsman to master, to be able to even make the steps to that chamber, and how important. So if you didn't master your work on those 7 things, the wardens would stop you and they would test you both ways. And if you didn't complete it, you weren't not allowed past that, or allowed the password to move forward.
It is interesting in all of the degrees in Masonry, this continued idea of obstruction, where this happens throughout the degrees in craft masonry, and this happens in the Royal Arch system of degrees. It is very interesting, and what we can look at is, what do these obstructions represent? In the first degree, these obstructions, they could represent any number of things. Now, in the second degree, you might have them actually represent these barriers, mental barriers, something Fratero somewhat mentioned earlier when we talked about fail-safes. There's a reason why dudes go crazy when they study the occult for too many years. There are several mathematicians who have committed suicide because they got, quote-unquote, too deep. They might be fail-safes. I'm not saying they are, and I'm not saying they didn't have other significant mental issues, but you have to understand that the human mind is so powerful, but it's also so delicate, and you need to be careful in the way you're programming your mind, which is a credit to the Masonic Fraternity in itself, having devised a system of degrees that I would say opens minds in a receptive manner for the most part for most people who are there for the right reasons.
Very well said. Freemasonry does a really good job in presenting you what the system is and how that system works. And I explain system to the conspiracy theorists that are listening. No, it's not the Illuminati to take over the world. It's more how to master yourself and take an idea or take a thought and to bring that from the intangible to the tangible and along that journey, as well as building yourself as a better character and squaring your actions as you more so to speak is like if you think of humanity as this big brick wall and you are a brick, and to be able to fit into that wall so that wall is really hew and straight, and to be the best possible brick that you can, you have to work on yourself. And then when you insert that brick into humanity, being that wall, you better the bricks around you because you're solid. And that continues outwards. And that's the most important thing. And if you're not doing that work on yourself and you're missing edges and you put that brick on the wall, of course, it's going to throw the whole wall off, if not possibly tip the whole wall over. Squaring your actions and getting down to the four things that were presented as the working tools is very, very, very important.
Very well said. Again, you have a great skill for presenting the analogy the way you did.
Oh, thanks. Well, you did too. We're fortunate to be in Masonry, to be presented all these amazing things that have been learned over thousands of years, that of just a melting pot of all these amazing fraternities to esoteric orders to even religions. And Freemasonry is not a religion. It's just a melting pot where it just takes truth and it combines it all together and presents it in a very philosophical form to the candidate and non-dogma form. And it's some deep stuff. And, when you start going deeper into meditation and start diving deeper into yourself, you're going to uncover a lot of interesting doors. And for me, it was really significant when I'll talk about a personal experience. So I'm in the second degree and I'm sitting there and I'm getting a lecture about the 7 liberal arts. And as he's doing that, I'm thinking about the human body. And immediately when he talked about astronomy, I immediately thought about the 7th chakra. And that's above body, right? That's the ether. That's everything. A huge correlation. If you start thinking about space and the universe as the crown chakra, it's pretty impressive for me. And I was just so blown away that it could be presented in a literary form in words to me that I was able to absorb and apply back to myself.
The way so the trivium, meaning your grammar, rhetoric, and your logic, are, of course, things that you should learn how to communicate. I mean, it's all about communication, those first 3. It's how to talk, how to win an argument, and ultimately how to point out somebody's faults in their argument, right? So your quadrivium being the last 4, and we've talked about this before in the past, but if you don't remember, arithmetic, which is numbers, geometry is numbers in space, music is numbers in time, and astronomy is numbers in space and time. So astronomy really pulls it together as, if you really want to think about it that way, I mean, space and time describes all of existence, and to study all of existence is what astronomy is. The next onion layer down, of course, the surface level is, yeah, sure, pick up an astronomy book and read about the revolutions and this, that, and the other, but it almost serves to, if you read an astronomy book, it almost serves to unlock some thing in your mind that starts asking deeper questions. Well, that's interesting how it does that. Why is it that way? And then you might start studying deeper mathematics and other things like that. I mean, that's where I went with mine. I've always been a huge math geek, and so I look at numbers and symbology, and then I also look at deep mathematic concepts that tend to challenge all of my beliefs about the world I see and experience. And I'm sure many of you out there have experienced something very similar, but we're all in the same boat, I guess. So I guess in closing, we've talked and we jumped all over the place with talking about the Fellowcraft degree, but that's because it was at some point the culmination of Freemasonry as we knew it. Everything that you needed to know about being a Mason was supposedly given to us within the second degree, or the first 2 degrees. So really look at that, and if you can get your hands on old manuscripts that describe old ritual and stuff like that, I highly suggest it. In fact, the Scottish Rite Ritual Monitor for the Southern Jurisdiction, it does a really good job in the first 100 pages or so talking about the degree systems, first and second degree systems, and the first quote-unquote high degree system, which was this senior fellow crafts honor, which was given away. And so with that, I think just remember some interesting things that you can wrap your head around, which would be every Mason is his own lodge. So think about that every time you're in lodge. Every time you're doing the fellowcraft degree, stare in and try to peer beneath those layers. So as we talked about philosophy in Masonry and what we teach, Freemasonry is essentially, and Fraternity and I have talked about this before, is the current school of whatever this is. Freemasonry is this successor of ancient mysteries in antiquity, right? So this is the school where we are supposed to do the big work. And I know that some lodges out there just don't do this. They're civic organizations or social clubs. They don't meet to talk about philosophy. Heck, mine doesn't either. But what is important is that on the outside we're having these discussions and you're talking with like-minded individuals and Masons who can help you by just being there and listening and letting you talk. And then if you listen while they talk, I mean, we really come away with some mind-blowing conclusions if you ever conclude. I mean, a lot of this you just can't have conclusions on because the ability to understand it is supposed to be beyond us, and we're never supposed to truly understand everything. But just think about that, and hopefully you guys will attend some fellowcraft degrees between now and the time Frater and I talk about the third degree. And that'll be an interesting conversation, I'm sure. We'll have a lot more to talk about. And with that, I'll hand it over to Fratero for closing remarks.
Polarity is an amazing thing, and it's found consistently throughout the universe, or even in your body or atoms. And, it's been represented very significantly here in the degree and, the power of what's been presented to you. Maybe you've seen the degree once. Maybe you've seen it 10 times. But every time you go back, just try to peel back another layer and look at what's been presented, because it's one of the most beautiful degrees, and there's a lot of information that's represented. And usually it takes a lot more times to go back to have it stick. So just keep on trying to expand your horizons and try to dig deeper.
Awesome. So for all of our listeners out there, just so you guys know, we haven't nailed down a date yet, but I believe Fratero will be joining us on the Masonic Roundtable at some point in the future, and hopefully we're going to have a really rad topic.